8. An act of perfidy. With the victory of the counter-revolution in Vienna and in Berlin, the decisive word had been spoken in Germany. All that was left of the achievements of the revolution was the Frankfurt Assembly, which had long ago lost all its political credit and which frittered away its energies in endless torrents of discussion about a paper constitution. In reality, the only question still outstanding was whether the assembly would be dismissed at the point of Prussian or Austrian bayonets. In December, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung described the development of the Prussian Revolution and counter-revolution in a series of brilliant articles, and then turned a hopeful eye to the rise of the French working class, from which it expected a world war. The country which has turned whole nations into its proletarians, which holds the whole world in its gigantic tentacles, which has once already paid the expenses of a European restoration, and in whose own lap the class contradictions have developed in their dearest and most shameless form, England, appears to be the rock against which the waves of revolution will break. England will starve the new society before it is born. England dominates the world market, and a transformation of economic relations in every country of Europe, on the whole continent, would be a storm in a teacup without England. The relations of industry and commerce within each country are determined by their relations with other countries, by their relations with the world market. But England dominates the world market, and England is dominated by the bourgeoisie. Thus, any social upheaval in France would be crushed by the English bourgeoisie, by the industrial and commercial world power of Great Britain. Any partial social reform in France or anywhere else on the European continent would remain, insofar as it was intended to be definitive, a pious and empty wish. Old England could be overthrown only by a world war, which alone could offer the Chartists, the organized party of the English proletariat, the conditions necessary for a successful insurrection against its powerful oppressors. Only when the Chartists were at the head of the English government would the social revolution advance from the world of utopia into the world of reality. The preliminary conditions for this future hope did not materialize. The French working class, still bleeding from 1,000 wounds received in the June days, was not capable of any new rising. The counter-revolution had begun its tour of Europe in Paris in the June days, going on to Frankfurt, Vienna, and Berlin, to end for the moment on December 10 with the election of the false Bonaparte as President of the French Republic. The revolution remained alive only in Hungary, and it found an eloquent and expert advocate in Engels, who had in the meantime returned to Cologne. For the rest, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung was compelled to limit its activities to a guerrilla war against the advancing counter-revolution. And it waged this struggle as daringly and as determinedly as it had waged the greater struggles of the previous year. A bundle of press writs loaded on it by the Reich government as the worst paper in a bad press, was greeted with the mocking remark that the Reich's power was the most comic of all comic powers, and the boastful display of Prussianism which the East Albion Junkers had adopted since the Berlin coup was answered with well-earned sarcasm. We Rhinelanders have had the good fortune to win a Grand Duke of the Lower Rhineland from the great reshuffle in Vienna. A man who has not fulfilled the conditions under which he became Grand Duke. A King of Prussia exists for us only through the Berlin Assembly. As there is no assembly for our Grand Duke of the Lower Rhineland, thus no King of Prussia exists for us. We fell into the hands of the Grand Duke of the Lower Rhineland as a result of jugglery with the fate of the peoples. And as soon as we are in a position to reject this jugglery, we shall ask the Grand Duke for his credentials. These lines were written during the wildest orgies of the counter-revolution. One thing is missing at first glance in the columns of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, something which one would expect to find there above all, namely, a detailed account of the activities of the German workers at the time. This movement was by no means insignificant, and it extended even into the districts of the East Albion Junkers themselves. It had its congresses, its organizations and its newspapers, and a capable leader in Stefan Born, who was friendly with Marx and Engels from the Paris and Brussels period and who still contributed to the Neue Rheinische Zeitung from Berlin and from Leipzig. Born understood the Communist Manifesto very well, but he was less successful in applying its principles to the undeveloped class consciousness of the proletariat of the greater part of Germany. Later on, Engels condemned Born's activities with unjust severity. But it is quite possible that Born is right when he declares in his memoirs that during the years of revolution neither Marx nor Engels ever expressed a word of dissatisfaction with his activities. Though this naturally does not exclude the possibility that they may have been dissatisfied with this or that detail. In any case, in the spring of 1849 Marx and Engels made the first move towards the working class movement, which had developed in the meantime independent of their influence. The fact that in the beginning the Neue Rheinische Zeitung paid very little attention to this movement can be explained in part by the fact that the Cologne Workers' Association had its own special organ, which appeared twice a week under the editorship of Moll and Schapper, and in part, indeed in greater part, by the circumstance that the Neue Rheinische Zeitung was above all an organ of democracy, that is to say, that it aimed at representing the joint interests of the bourgeoisie and of the proletariat against absolutism and feudalism. At that time this task was most important because it helped to create the basis on which the proletariat could begin its own discussion with the bourgeoisie. However, the bourgeois section of the democracy demoralized rapidly, and at every more or less serious test it collapsed miserably. There was such men as Mehring and Kriegen on the Committee of Five which had been elected in June, 1848, by the First Democratic Congress. Under such leadership the organization began to decline rapidly. This became disastrously plain when it met for the second time on the eve of the Prussian coup d'état. A new committee was elected and Dester, a personal friend and political supporter of Marx, was a member of it, but this was little more than a bill drawn on the future. The parliamentary left wing of the Berlin Assembly failed in the November crisis and the left wing of the Frankfurt Assembly sank deeper and deeper into the morass of miserable compromises. In this situation Marx, Wilhelm Wolff, Schapper and Hermann Becker announced their resignation from the Democratic District Committee on the I5th of April, justifying their action as follows. In our opinion the present form of organization of the democratic associations embraces too many heterogeneous elements to make possible any useful activity in furtherance of its aim. In our opinion a closer association of workers' organizations will be more useful because these organizations are composed of similar elements. At the same time the Cologne Workers' Association resigned from the Association of Rhenish Democratic Organizations and invited all working class and other organizations upholding the principles of social democracy to send representatives to a provincial congress on the 6th of May. This latter congress was called to decide on an organization of Rhenish Westphalian workers' associations, and whether delegates should be sent to a congress of all working-class organizations called for June in Leipzig by Born's organization, the Leipzig Workers' Brotherhood. On the 20th of March, before these steps were taken, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung had begun to publish Wilhelm Wolff's articles on the Silesian Billion, which so aroused the rural proletariat. And on the 5th of April it began to publish the lectures which Marx had delivered to the workers' associations in Brussels on wage labor and capital. After showing on the basis of the tremendous mass struggles of 1848 that every revolutionary insurrection must fail, no matter how removed its aim might appear to be from the class struggle, so long as the working class had not been victorious, the paper turned its attention to the problem of economic relations, on which the existence of the bourgeoisie and the slavery of the workers were both based. However, this promising development was interrupted by the struggles which now took place around the paper constitution that had finally been botched together by the Frankfurt Assembly. In itself the precious constitution was not worth the shedding of a single drop of blood, and the hereditary imperial crown it sought to place on the head of the King of Prussia was for all the world like a fool's cap. The King of Prussia did not accept, but he also did not definitely refuse. He wanted to negotiate with the German princes on the question of the Reich Constitution in the secret hope that they would agree to Prussian hegemony in return for Prussian military services in destroying what was left of the gains of the revolution in the small states and statelets. This was a blatant piece of body snatching and it fanned the spark of revolution into a flame again, causing a number of insurrections which received their name if they did not derive their content from the Reich Constitution. The Constitution, after all, embodied the sovereignty of the people, which was to be destroyed in order to establish the sovereignty of the princes once again. Armed insurrections in support of the Reich Constitution took place in the Kingdom of Saxony, in the Grand Duchy of Baden and in the Bavarian Palatinate. Everywhere the King of Prussia played the part of hangman, though afterwards the other potentates cheated him of the hangman's wage. Isolated insurrections also took place in the Rhineland, but they were crushed immediately by an overwhelming weight of numbers thanks to the strong military forces which the government had drafted into the much-feared province. The authorities then plucked up sufficient courage for an annihilating blow against the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. As the signs of a new revolutionary rising made themselves felt everywhere, the flames of revolutionary enthusiasm rose higher and higher in its columns, and in fact the special editions it issued in April and May were nothing but appeals to the people to hold itself in readiness for the coming insurrection. The reactionary Kreuzzeitung did it the honor of declaring that its insolence was monumental and that the activities of the Moniteur of 1793 paled before it. The government was itching to lay its hands on the paper, but did not dare. Thanks to the spirit of the Rhineland juryman, 2 legal proceedings against Marx had done nothing but win him new laurels, and a suggestion from Berlin that martial law should again be declared in Cologne was evaded by the nervous commandant of the garrison, who instead applied to the police for the expulsion of Marx as a dangerous individual. The request embarrassed the police, who turned the matter over to the provincial governor, who in his turn passed on his share of the unpleasantness to Manteuffel, the Minister of the Interior. On the 10th of March the provincial government reported to Berlin that Marx was still in Cologne, though he had no police permission to stay there, and that the newspaper he edited was still pursuing its destructive aims, its incitement against the existing constitution and its demand for the establishment of a social republic, whilst at the same time mocking and ridiculing everything humanity respected and held dear. The paper was becoming more and more dangerous in view of the fact that the temper and insolence with which it was written were steadily increasing the number of its readers. The police, the report went on, had misgivings regarding the request of the commandant of the garrison for the expulsion of Marx, and the provisional government was compelled to support the police because an expulsion without any particular reason other than the tendency and the dangerousness of the newspaper edited by him might cause a demonstration on the part of the Democratic Party. After receiving this report, Manteuffel approached Eichmann, the president of the Rhine province, to obtain his opinion. On the 29th of March Eichmann declared that the expulsion of Marx would be justifiable, but attended with difficulties unless Marx were guilty of further offences. On the 7th of April Manteuffel then informed the provincial government that he had no objection to the expulsion, but that he must leave the time and circumstances to the provincial government, and that he felt it desirable for the order of expulsion to be issued in connection with some particular offence. In the end, however, the order of expulsion was issued solely on account of the dangerous tendency of the paper edited by Marx and not on account of any particular offence. This was done on the 11th of May, when apparently the government felt itself strong enough to deliver a blow it had been too cowardly to deliver on the 29th of March or the 7th of April. The Prussian professor who recently unearthed the documentary record of the affair in the state archives did great honor to the poetic and prophetic vision of Friele Grott, who wrote under the immediate impression of the expulsion: "No honest blow in an honest fight, but the spite of malice and trick, the skulking infamy lays me low." Of the wretched Western Kalmuck,